evening and welcome. Uh, Thank you. On behalf of Cornerstone, I'd like to welcome you to our new campus, firstly. Uh, my name's Tulani Tulahadu. Uh, I have the pleasure of working at Cornerstone. We're still trying to figure out what I do. Uh, so, again, it's a privilege to welcome you all to this particular episode of our Critical Dialogues, which aim to drive not only community engagement, uh, but position itself as a thought leader in community aspects. Um, Today's dialogue is titled Echoes of the Past, the Transgenerational Transmission of Trauma in Cape Town. I struggle to actually memorize those TTTs. Uh, so, in a nutshell, I think while it is positioned as echoes, it's not something in the past. It's something that we are confronted with as a reality day. So, as much as we're here to reflect, we need to also keep in mind that the profound truth is that the past is not behind us, but embedded in us, especially in Cape Town, where there's legacies of forced removals, systemic violence, racial exclusion. Uh, and with all these, they continue to shape our identity, and it doesn't end when it ends. It's a generational uh, curse, so to speak, that's transmitted into our survival, into our socioeconomic conditions, and even our identity as it forms. Uh, my role, again, is just to map this out and introduce you to the panel that is in the know, try to put it that way. So I'll introduce the four panelists, uh, starting the far end with Dr. Umsama Makubu, who is a professor in art history at the University of Cape Town. She is the director of the Institute of Creative Arts and founder of Creative Knowledge Resources. Makubu was also the Deputy Dean for Transformation in the Humanities Faculty at UCT from 2020 to 2022. She received the American Council of Amendment Society. At the start directly. She received. Sure. Look, I think if we're talking about generational curses and generational trauma, these are things that you've earned, and that is a trauma response, if I can put it down. So I will read everyone's bio. I will do that. She received the American Council of Higher of Learned Societies African Humanities Program Fellowship Award and was elected to be African Studies Association Presidential Fellow in 2016. In 2017, she was UCT Harvard Mandela Fellow at Hutchins Center for African and American Research. Makubu has curated various exhibitions and formed part of the curatorial team for the 55th and 58th Venice Biennial in 2030 and 2019, respectively. She's also published creative books and research papers. Dr. Makubu, and also our next panelist is Dr. Shanaz Hossein. She's a senior lecturer and social worker in the Department of Social Work and Social Development at UCT. Dr. Youssef is a Bristol and University of Cape Town Research Fellow for 2023 and 2025, focusing on co-creating non-related communities who have a hidden heritage of enslavement
Her PhD was based on intergenerational trauma and legacies of violence, such as intimate partner violence, family, and gang violence. She has presented her work on intergenerational trauma at both local and international audiences, as well as being a regular guest speaker on radio and in print media. Dr. Hussein represents higher education in the Western Cape's Forum for Victim Empowerment. She collaborates regularly with local authorities and with the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation. Dr. Hussein?
I'll introduce Dr. Wade Palmer.
Who was raised in the Cape Flats and attended Stellenbosch High School. He pursued higher education at the University of Wits, completing both a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Medicine. Dr. Palmer is the founder and director of Harmwell Medical Centers, the network of multidisciplinary facilities delivering patient-centered comprehensive care. His work focuses on decentralizing healthcare to make it accessible, affordable, and community-based. In addition to his medical career, he's an entrepreneur and with ventures spanning a coffee business, health technology, and sports recovery. Dr. Wade Powell.
You got in a cost lion and covering of gadgets, by the way. Leo Makura is our very own here from Cornerstone, who will be moderating this discussion. He is the head of the Sociology and Community Development Department here at Cornerstone, where he also lectures and does research and is also an academic advisor. He holds a master's degree in industrial psychology from the University of Cape Town and is currently completing his doctoral studies in industrial psychology at the University of Cape Town. Apart from teaching, researching, and studying, they are also it always play in the mirror. The beer. See, try it. Sorry. Little thing. You guys know it, right? So I will take my leave and lead you to guide us. So it's very important.
I don't know if you can both hear me clearly. I should start by saying good evening to everyone who made it here, and I should thank you all for attending this event. It's a very special event, and for Cornerstone community, which includes students, which includes its lecturers and the communities around. So basically, as my colleague Tuban Kabir said, this is part of our series of critical dialogues. And today's topic is focusing on, one of the very, sensitive topics in post-apartheid South Africa, and the topic is on intergenerational trauma. Trauma is something that we talk about every day in everyday conversations, in the medical field, in the academia, and but we haven't really, given it much thought. And we haven't had an intense discussion about what trauma is and how it continues to impact our communities and what we can do to break the cycle intergenerational trauma. So basically today, our focus is on understanding how trauma is transmitted, from generation to generation. How trauma becomes a community or rather a collective experience, and it's a multi-generational experience in South Africa. So we need to understand how it's transmitted from one generation to another. Secondly, we also want to understand the economic impact, or rather the social economic impact of trauma. Those who find themselves in traumatic experiences and are trapped in a cycle of trauma, how do they function? Does trauma really act as a deterrent to functioning, active as, as an economic agent in this, society? How do we break the cycle of trauma so that people become, active, like agents in their own development? Then, last but not least, we'll focus on different pathways that we can explore to break the cycle of trauma. Today, I should say that I feel humbled to be surrounded by three experts who have spent considerable time understanding trauma, dealing with issues related to trauma, and I'm going to try to do my justice, to help them, share their views and perspectives as far as the challenge of intergenerational trauma in South Africa is concerned. I will start by giving them each of them a 10-minute presentation opportunity, and in this presentation they will say whatever they deem fit or right for, or rather whatever they is actually very important for the audience in terms of intergenerational trauma. So I'll start with Dr. Hussein to share her perspectives on intergenerational trauma in South Africa, and she will speak from her perspective as a seasoned academic, as well as a practitioner within the social work practice. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to stick to my 10 minutes. I'll not repeat something. Usually I just speak, but as academics, we can speak too much. So I've started with, I've asked the question, have we truly healed from apartheid and are you serious of enslavement? And when I asked that question, I immediately thought of Dr. Death. I think it's better be some we still practice in medicine. So how can we heal if our perpetrators are still wandering around us? And what I also want to add is that how fitting, and that I've come full circle. My grandmother worked at Rick Steel as a machinist many years ago in the 1950s. And I'm also aware that there are others whose maybe grandparents worked at the exterior forms. And they could only work at the exterior form as machinists or in the big industry because there were no other jobs available for them. And so, as I said, I know that maybe your grandparents may have worked here as well. And so, how does that relate to my work and to intergenerational trauma? For me, as a social worker, it means that as a people, we have not only overcome apartheid, but also genocide and enslavement. And I think that we do need a moment to pause and reflect. Perhaps reflect on those who worked there. Perhaps reflect on those we've lost and what we've lost as a society. And so, but also the fact that we are also resilient as a people. And so maybe you can just take a moment to kind of reflect on that. And then as a social worker, I also want you to take care of yourself as you listen to our conversation that we have. Because I do know that some of you may be unexpectedly triggered by what we say, or maybe you didn't think of something, and that can affect you. And my experience when I'm talking about the past with communities, I often find there will be one or two people who has been affected. And so we will mention resources at the end where you can go and speak to someone or be referred. And so, as I said, as a social worker and an African scholar, and having grown up on the Cape Flats, I was really interested in intergenerational trauma because what my research indicated is that the violence and the gang violence, the community violence, the family violence, the high rates of substance abuse it didn't just happen overnight. Um, and actually, the research indicates that it's a result of trauma of the past, which as a society we may not have processed, or things that we may not have worked through. And maybe we haven't processed it because maybe we thought it's not important to talk about, or maybe we were told that it doesn't matter, or that we need to get over it and move on. And so what that actually means is that when we start to understand what intergenerational trauma there is, it's trauma that has been passed on from one generation to the next. Can be in your family or it can be in your community. And it happens, being trauma there is not worked through. Either your trauma, your family's trauma, or a community's trauma, where that trauma is actually ignored and treated, as I said, as if nothing important or serious actually happened. So get over it. Um, and I said, what did we do then with the trauma of the previous generations? Have we ever thought about that? So where did it go? You know, if your parents or great grandparents were experienced about it, what happened to those things? What happened to their emotions? And usually with trauma, we want to suppress it or we want to forget it, right? And we may unintentionally transmit it to those around us, and particularly onto the next generation. And so you can see that when when we've been silenced, or we are silent as a person, or as a group, or as a people, that was when the trauma is transmitted. And so why is intergenerational trauma so important to understand and disrupt? It's important because we cannot heal from what we do not acknowledge. And so our communities and our families may be acting out a wound that has not been treated. Uh, and what you then often see is that when doctors and psychologists maybe point to a personal trauma, sometimes as communities we don't understand that trauma can actually be anything where we lose our safe space. And that is not, it doesn't only have to be something you've witnessed directly. It can be something you've heard about, even though you were not present. It can also then be a group that experiences that at the same time. And that is trauma as well, collective trauma. And one of the ways, as I said, in which this trauma is passed on or transmitted, number one, can be through genetics. But an important thing as a society, silence, as I've said earlier, where we have been silenced by society, or when we choose to be silent. And sometimes that silence is about shame, sometimes that silence is also about guilt. And so our communities, they may have been silenced, and our communities may have then choose not to talk about it. And one of my favorite trauma authors, Pastor van der Kolk, he said, it takes enormous trust and courage to allow yourself to remember. And so when we actually do start to remember and we break our silence, we can actually heal and disrupt the trauma and prevent it from being transmitted. Not only our personal trauma, but the trauma in our families and communities. But healing can also be economic justice. Healing can also mean justice that perpetrators are treated by the law. Because sometimes what we saw in the TRC, we saw perpetrators go free also. And as I said, they got amnesty, and some of them are still walking around. what my research and other scholars are also talking about is when we think of intergenerational trauma, we want to disrupt that trauma. We want to end cycles. And so I'm very interested in helping communities, helping them to think, and me with they think about what are the ways that we can interrupt and disrupt these harmful patterns in our community. And that can be through obtaining support, intergenerational dialogues like this, talking and sharing about our experiences, expressing our feelings of pain, shame, guilt, grief, learning emotional words actually. And it's not impossible. My mom, that's my 2 minute. My mom was a disruptor of trauma in my family, and she didn't have the academic qualifications I had. She grew up in District 6 and was aware and involved in politics like many of our parents and great grandparents. And she ensured that she raised me to believe that I could be anything despite my color. She got the necessary support from doctors, church, friends, organizations to help myself and my siblings cope when my dad was diagnosed with bipolar. And now, neither of my siblings nor I have bipolar or any mental health conditions. Sometimes my siblings disagree with that. I'm the one. And so, to conclude, I'd like you to know that what you and your family and community have experienced matters, and that intergenerational trauma is not about blaming previous generations or your parents or your grandparents, but it's about something more forgiving. It's really about a family or a community who is trying to heal from a wound or trauma that happened a long time ago. And so I'd like to say, let's create support and safe spaces so we don't get lost in that transmission of trauma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hussein. That's a very informative presentation. We will come to questions a little later. In the meantime, I will hand over to Dr. Omar to give his 10-minute presentation.
Good evening, everybody. So the doctor title got me in the door, and the doctor title now falls. Okay. I do a lot of these talks, and I always say it just gets in through the door. Okay. But doctor sense is something very interesting and very true. And someone said it to me last week. That in itself is a generational trauma or curse that has been broken. So I'm the first in my family to have gone that. Right. Yeah. And so I'm going to speak as a man. I think it's necessary. I was going to do something a bit more clinical, but when I look in the room, or myself and the rest of us as part of the college, I think there's 3, 4 men. How many women are there? Must tell of what's going on in our community. It's scary. Because how many households, which then form part of these communities, and these communities form part of districts, and the districts form part of a province, and the province, our country, and then Africa. And so there's a lot that needs to be addressed and I don't believe that it's going to come to an end very quickly, or we're going to find solutions very quickly. Men, by definition, should just be termed as stubborn, should just be. So I am a very very vulnerable individual. The last 3 weeks have been very interesting. Andre, I said after this talk, I'm probably going to handpick which talks I do, because I had to face this very topic for the last weeks. until yesterday. And I almost felt like I shouldn't do this talk today because all the emotions was so fitting and so telling that it would have probably had so much power here. And I probably would have cried, but I'm not going to do that. So now when I look at it again, the crux of it is that there's healing in that process. So it is possible, right? And I'm a testament to that. So speaking of testament, I am Christian. So this doesn't offend anybody, but I am I was challenged with something in these few weeks, the difference between honesty and transparency. Honesty, and I think this was a conversation that I had with myself. The difference between honesty and transparency. Honesty has limitation, transparency allows me heal. It's like looking at a window and you know that there's frosting. You can see an image behind that, but you don't know what it is. But if it's transparent, you will see exactly what. So look at it, and the Bible speaks about confessing your sins. So first to God for forgiveness, and that's in 1 John 1 verse 9. In confessing your sin to others, that allows for healing. And healing in communities is so important when men themselves can be honest and open with each other about where I have faith. And that is in James 5 verse 16. And then there's relational restoration, which is in Matthew 5:3. And so thank you, Baptiste, for going through the whole introduction. So I actually have to go through much of my presentation because there's going to be a lot of overlap again. But I do want to say, so from a clinical perspective, we've got a what they call a biopsychosocial approach, which looks at someone holistically. And in this is how I practice. I'm a very unorthodox, but DAPE. My patients know you don't come to me for medication because we don't ask your exa. Do everything else before medication. That's the reality. Yeah, because I believe that 90% of the things that we experience are as a result of what we do or don't do on a day-to-day basis. Okay. And so it was very interesting reading up about this. And so again, this challenges me because I'm going to go back to my family. And I'm going to speak to the men in my family. Because one of the things that I learned is that transgenerational trauma can extend up to 4 generations. That's scary. And I didn't have kids of my own, but a nephew. And so I look at it, my brother and I have those conversations and we say, okay, so what of our traumas that we've experienced in my immediate family, so father, mother, does the buck end here with us? And I think we often hear that this generation is weak because they cry, they complain about it, can't they? Flip it around. The generation that's turning around and saying, no, we want to face the problem comes in. A family does not want to have the discussion because it's painful. But you don't understand what actually it causes to the very kids that you are trying to raise. Not for yourselves, but for the world. Because you will die. You will have an expiration date. What do you leave behind is what you install in your children. And it's not just your family, man. So do they have the skill set? So we can talk about accessibility and potentially the healing process, but do they actually have the skill set to do so? And no one says that. Majority of our communities don't say that. And so how one of the very interesting things with transmission of transgenerational trauma is that you have the studies that are now being done on semen analysis, the weak seed to conceive. And they've picked up that stresses now change those genetics and epigenetics. So what exists between parents or before they conceive is already being transmitted from the very moment that the egg and that sperm combine. Then you have vertical transmission. So I firmly believe that women, men listen up carefully. They always say a happy wife or a happy life is a reason for it. Okay, there's truth to it. But a happy man is God's play. Right? You don't need to add up. That's our side. But I want to say women are integrators or actually creative. Give them a seat or give them a try. Give them a house. turns into a hoe. It gives you stress. It gives you stress. So what we give women will eventually be incubated within them. So imagine that you give to a woman. Where does that vertical transmission go? Into your offspring. And then you don't want to take responsibility for that. So when you have an excess child, and they say you are your mother's child, your mother's anxious, where does it stem from? Interesting. You will probably be the cause of as a male. All right, so there's that vertical transmission that also needs to be considered. And then there's this lot of studies that go into the first 1,000 days of life for kids, where they just absorb absolutely everything. And we often see this where kids come around and we're with family, and then one of the kids sees a swear word, and everyone laughs. It's funny. But then you're like, wait. Where is this child here? Don't clear though. Someone is reading. And so they absorb absolutely everything. How you love, how you speak to each other, how you deal with arguments. I often tell my kids, I think the greatest injustice you did to me was not being real and authentic in being individuals and peers. Because you two were people, you're fighting silent letters, but you close the door. I don't know what it looks like to then deal with conflict. I haven't lived. So I'm left to watch social media. I'm left to influences from other friends. Right? What happens if parent dies? So I'm not saying go shout in front of your kids or anything like that. But it should maybe trigger a thought of, why is it that we actually can't have a difficult conversation with an open door? Is it because we shout? So there's a bit of shame and embarrassment maybe about how we deal with things. And so we can't expose our kids to business. But those things are what also condition them for good. It creates resilience in a world that demands it on them. Walking to school is now an excuse for. You don't know if your child is going to deal with this. And then the other thing that was important that I was looking at was untold stories. And this is where I'm saying I'm going back to my grandfather. Both my granddads are still alive, was still alive. And so I am going to challenge them with conversation. And I'm telling you, it's going to be very difficult conversations with. And I know that. But you are going to have the conversation with me because the party is with me. I already have kids yet. So I need to heal, not for myself only, but for my kids, because I fully understand that what's in me is going to go and be birthed into this world. Okay, and so then we've got the biopsychosocial approach where we have everything, the psychological aspect, the social aspect, the physical aspect. And we often see this where people have spaces and then they develop depression, and then there's panic attacks and anxiety and substance use, inability to function and school, work. And so it definitely has a significant impact on the well-being of our community. And so when you look at where we implement changes, it kind of starts it out. That's the first place where all of these, where we spend most of our time, most likely. And so where we form parts of communities, a lot of that solutions are actually based at all. Because it's very difficult to have conversations or allow for conversations to be had at school, for example. So, and unfortunately, curriculums are being passed down whether you like it or not, and you're just finding out about it. Because one, we neglect and throw away our social responsibility by not teaching up for discussions at community halls before they pass a bill. And then we shock when they say the legal age for termination of pregnancy is 12, you don't need your parenting. I see your children. That's real. And you know when that was passed? When Jacob Zuma was fighting his own candidates. Chaos holds past. Because we're not paying attention to the things that matter. And that's our responsibility. And so that should be a challenge. And when you see things where they're asking for your opinion, go. Even as young people, we should be going. We're making decisions about the future. And if we kick up a racket about it, it doesn't get passed. So we play a role in that hearing through our education system. You don't know what's being taught.
I sorry, I'm long into that in talk rock. Okay, and then just possible interventions is actually looking at how we address those traumas. And it takes a lot of bravery. It's very difficult. Like I said, I literally had to face 3 weeks of a generational trauma that I thought I had been in. We pitched up again in a very different way. And it was very difficult for me to hit. And it nearly broke me until my friend said really interesting words to me. You forgot who you are. Do I need to remind you of 2016 Wade? And it changed everything. It took those words to change everything because what I had experienced had almost stripped my identity. And gets me to a point where I was probably going to stay for a very long time. I neglected my businesses for 3 weeks. I was just coasting and cruising through life. And so it's as much as we try to have those conversations, accessibility does become a very important aspect. And we don't, unfortunately, have enough of. It's not in our schools enough. I actually applaud Muizenberg High School. I did a talk there last weekend with a group of parents that their kids they're not in detention. Okay, so they've got sleep disciplines. The kids are not in detention, but they want to figure out why the kids are behaving the way that they are. And so they now spend their Saturdays with counselors and a whole bunch of stuff. It's just still a punishment if you think about it. And the first time I had this conversation with them last year, I said to them, you guys are sitting here because you didn't abide by rules and regulations. And so now the rest of your class is out there enjoying the fruits of the world while you are wasting your weekend. But I spoke to the parents about this, and it was a very interesting opportunity to have that discussion. And I had 4 fathers come to me because they now understand that you as parents are mirror images of your children. Well, your children are mirror images of it. They learned from it. So we get upset looking at our kids, but you're actually upset with yourself. That is it's important to understand. Because when you look at your children, they downloaded absolutely everything from me. How you love, how you don't love. And you hear that you like Gerard na your ma, of your pa, of your titi, of whatever. Right? So your behavior is mimicked by your children. And as the braid would have it, you do it enough. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. So how you respond to trauma is how your kids will respond to trauma, and their kids will respond to traumas. The problem is it gets exacerbated by the external traumas that they experience, and leads to a generation then that never gets out of a sight. So I indicated family when I started my first practice. I think I must finish. I'm going to finish up. I had a practice. My RTB just went down saying, first practice I had. Stood outside, walked along the perimeter, and there was this family. The lady there were 3 stands all making beautiful souls. And they're all making money. But I spoke to the one lady, and it was very interesting to me that she's the 4th person or 4th generation to be standing selling guru also. And I immediately realized, wow, she's stuck in his cycle of whatever trauma she's experienced. Because at this point in time, I would have considered the fact that you should probably have at a restaurant by now and not selling proposals. But the truth of it is that they stay. And they never face that, and it's very difficult to do. So was our.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palmer. I think because of time, I'm going to hand over straight to Dr. Maku.
Is this one? Okay, it does. Good evening, everyone. So this morning when I told my husband that I was coming here, he said, yes, my mother worked at Trex True Form. So yeah, it's deep. But thank you all for being here. Thank you to my co-panelists for it and the introduction. Thank you for grounding us.
in the discussion and also to the organizers for bringing us together this evening. Collective trauma is often described by scholars as the psychological reactions to a traumatic event that affect an entire society. What this definition fails to do is to account for the fact that enslavement, colonialism, apartheid, and economic apartheid are not events. An event has a specific temporality. It begins, it ends. These are sustained systems of racial capitalism that reproduce trauma. And I think, as you've said, we are not living in the aftermath of enslavement, colonialism, apartheid. We're in the midst of it. Just because a structure of dispossession changes a label does not mean it ceases to exist. We are not only dealing with old wounds that are transferred, but also new ones inflicted upon us every day. Only we are not always able to identify the source of affliction. The label is no longer colonialism or apartheid, but the structure of dispossession is the same. Yes, apartheid means that my parents and their parents were deeply humiliated, and this may contribute to who I become, but it doesn't always account for that feeling of walking into a shop and being treated as though you're a thief, walking into a restaurant and being treated as though you are lost and lack social grace, going to a clinic and be treated as though your life is worthless and disposable. It's knowing that you are spending more on transport to get to work than what the people who earn more spend on the same. It's the everyday diminishing of dignity and the denial to quality health, education, and services. It's the old systemic disposition at play. It is the recursive nature of violence in the ordinary that the generations who came before us could have never prepared us for. I think the issue with understanding collective trauma is perceptibility. The source of the collective wound is internalized and normalized. It is too abstract to be perceptible. This is where the arts are crucial, and I'm here, I guess, to talk about the arts, because they can make the abstract perceptible. I often use the example of Bonolo Kavula's work. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the artist Bonolo Kavula. I see a nod. And this is a video artwork titled "You Must Be Exhausted," which was created in 2014. The video is a very simple yet poignant, looped shot of a cup of tea being made. As the tea bag is placed in the cup, water, milk, and sugar are poured, and the tea is stirred. We hear the voice of the artist, and she says, "You must be exhausted. A little refreshment, Mrs. van der Merwe? The maid will take your coat. Gin, brandy, rum? Or perhaps you would like the maid to mix you a refreshing lemonade. Do sit down, Mrs. van der Merwe. You walked all the way from the front gate on your own legs. Ha! You must be exhausted. Next time, you wait by the gate, and the maid will carry you. No problem, my dear. These black women, they're so strong." So each time, she repeats it over and over, and each time she uses a different accent, cynically mocking apartheid-era white middle-class women in South Africa. Those exact sentences are taken from a 1992 film, Sarafina. So most of us, I think, know Sarafina, which was based on the 1976 youth uprising. The scene that the artist size from the movie is when the main character, Sarafina, a role that was played by Lelete Khumalo, visits her mother, the role that was played by Miriam Makeba, who works for a white family as a domestic worker and cannot be with her own children because she lives in the servants' quarters. Upon arriving in the suburban home, Sarafina finds her mother alone in the house cleaning. Her mother welcomes her and tells her to sit in the lounge while she gets refreshments. Left alone in the lounge, Sarafina throws herself on the couch and scatters the cushions as she sarcastically mimics the white madam while reciting the lines that Bunolokafula refers to. So in this scene, she shows her frustration at losing her mother in the futile service of white households, far from the struggle and ongoing police violence in black townships, and in losing her father in his service to the political struggle. In essence, at that point in the film, she sees her father's sacrifices in the struggle as far greater than those of her mother as a domestic worker. This intergenerational dialogue between mother and daughter emphasizes the differential ways in which being in service of and caring for often involves the violence that's embedded in the mundane, the ordinary, like making tea as a servant. As a servant, Sarafina's mother takes care of and services the white family, even though she detests it. Sarafina is then left to take care of her siblings and is involved in the youth anti-apartheid politics, and eventually is arrested for it. Between mother and child, solidarity would mean sacrifice. For Sarafina to understand why her mother continues to work for white people, that she sees as callous, uncaring, and ruthless, she would have to give up her political ideals. But for her mother to convince Sarafina that for the family to survive, she needs the work, even if it means sacrificing the time to parent her own children and sacrificing her own participation in the struggle. For both, there is the effective labor required in political work, but there's also the effective labor forced upon them by circumstance. One is also reminded of the disparate spaces both occupy, the mother in the white suburbs, the child in the black township. This spatial division underlies Sarafina's disobedience to her mother and her own disrespect for the white household. In this way, effective labor not only includes care, love, and companionship, it encompasses antagonism, much of what you've been speaking about, across generations, where the sense of collective trauma is hinged on precarious solidarity among those who are traumatized. So towards the end of the video, the teacup, of course, is being stirred, and then she pushes it off the table and it shatters on the floor. I've now lost my place, sorry. Too many movements. And it shatters on the floor. And at this point, the artist says, I remember asking my grandfather what apartheid was like. He didn't say much. Like they don't, and I'm saying it in the way that she says it in the Leo. She says, he didn't say much. Like they don't talk about it. So I was like, what was it like? He was like, what? I said, apartheid, back in the day. And then he said, everything was yabas, niebas. That's all he said. Like I couldn't get anything more out of him. And then yabas, niebas. So every time I think about it, it's yabas, niebas. The impossible intergenerational dialogue in this scenario draws our attention to the imperceptibility and unspeakability of trauma. But then it facilitates the possibility of reading and interpreting those sciences. Yabas, niebas might not seem like saying much, but it tells us something about the profound humiliation and dehumanization. For a grandfather to tell a grandchild that they had completely lost their agency in such a way that there's nothing else to say except yabas, niebas, is unsettling. It refers to, in the way that Frantz Fanon defines it, the totalizing wound on the psyche, and also points to how the social critic Cornel West defines nihilism, the view that life is meaningless and valueless. It alludes to the corrosion of belief systems and the weakening or collapse of social structures. It is a psychosocial condition of apathy and disillusionment and hopelessness, or life against life. And it reflects, it's a reflection of political alienation. And it continues, as Cornel West puts it, through the pervasion of Black culture by Martech forces, profit making, the pleasure principle, and the crisis in Black leadership, as well as the underlying social irresponsibility of the Black middle class. And combined with the legacy of white supremacist beliefs, this pervasion of market forces prompts nihilistic self-loathing, a deep existential angst. For the historically traumatized, we have to deny their identity, their very being, to operate in the world that's defined by the market. And it limits the range of possible meanings that we can draw off to make life meaningful. What falls apart is the sense of the collective. Collective trauma manifests in things that might be experienced individually. So we often say that person is violent. And when that person is violent, that person as an individual is a problem. We don't think about what's social, creative, it's all of those things are too abstract. And the individualization of trauma makes it hard to politicize it. And since we exist in a socially isolating world that valorizes competition, it also has this ideal of a good life, how we understand failure, success, desire, aspirations. All of this is organized in such a way that we accept and buy into the very same structures that reproduce trauma. As I actually remember, I wasn't going to mention this, but it reminds me of an installation by the artist Gabrielle Goliath, where she placed a body at an entrance to a venue where the event was happening. And it's almost as if the same sort, you pass it and you think it's a hopeless person under a blanket. And the number of people that simply just walked right over the body, so just skipped so that they can get to the venue, right? Without considering that might be an actual human being, we see people every day. But we are, as I've said, within societies that are organized around isolation, that it's hard to actually respond appropriately to trauma when we see it. And again, I've lost my place, my apologies. And this is reminiscent of how the cultural theorist Lauren Berlant talks about cruel optimism. She turns attention to the logic of a good life. Cruel optimism describes attachments to compromised conditions of possibility, whose realization is discovered to be impossible, right? So it's like we go to work that might be toxic, that might lead us to not being well, but we do it because we believe that at the end there's a reward. At the end, there's something that's going to allow us to live our lives in the way that we imagine our lives will be, right? And there's a sense that even if you were to give up the thing that's actually draining you, that's exhausting your resources, you wouldn't endure it, right? So we know, like the fact of queuing. I mean, just driving here today, just watching the queues of people waiting for transport. It's just the time that people spend. It's exhausting. It's hard. But cruel optimism is that we have to do it, right? Even if that source, there's a thing that can fire, and the assumption is that to get to that desire, we have to undergo these things that actually traumatize us, but also part of the systems that produce trauma. I'm almost done. So individualization makes it harder to address collective trauma, harder to organize, harder to build solidarity, harder to recognize the source of the recurring infliction. We need collective resistance, which is further complicated by the fact that we still have areas produced by racial segregation and what Catherine McKittrick calls geographies of domination. Through this kind of economic spatial entrapment, racial capitalism produces distractions like commodity fetishism and aspirations for individual wealth. And the eternal divisions that are deepened by this reality retard the eventuality of collective resistance to heal collective trauma. And so while art might not always be the medicine, it can at least peel away the illusion and alert us to the distractions so that we can train our attention on what keeps producing collective trauma. And it's probably the reason why we don't have art galleries accessible in our own communities. We don't have the spaces to enjoy it. We don't have the spaces to think. So, and I think that's the role that it can play. Thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists, for very informative presentations. I have a couple of questions, but because you all presented, I think, quite a number of questions we, answered. But I want to come back to the, concept of a trauma itself. I know in everyday, discussion, we always think of trauma as an individual experience. But take your presentations, we now understand that trauma is actually a collective experience. But so the question is, to what extent are communities, or rather, marginalized communities, aware of the fact that, the trauma that they think is actually an individual experience, it's actually a shared experience, because it's from that understanding that we're able to actually, resolve the problem of intergenerational goal. So to what extent are community members, those who are experiencing, traumatic, who are actually having, traumatic experiences, to what extent do they believe, or rather understand, that they actually share these experiences with significant others in communities? We can start with you, Dr. Hussein, your experience as a social worker.
From my experience, I think that there's an understanding that we are suffering, but the word trauma, people don't necessarily use that word. And if you consider many languages, even for example, in sign language, I discovered on my journey that there isn't a word for trauma in the sign language. So I can imagine that that word is expressed very differently in different languages in our country. And that then is an indication. It's not an indication that people don't know that they are suffering. I think our communities do know that they are suffering. But so even that word needs to change. So when I go into communities, then I will sometimes use the word, and I'll say when bad things happen or when you are suffering. But managing that and how people deal with that, I think that people do struggle because there aren't spaces, as my colleague said.
Thank you so much for your response. I want to come back to Dr. Makulu. You made a very, interesting point, which actually is captured in the, title, this critical dialogue. The fact that, the structures, the above it, discriminatory practices, as well as, the system of disposition, is still prevalent today, and it perpetuates, collective trauma. What can be done to actually, deal with the problem of intergenerational trauma, and to actually just decisively deal with the problem, rather than focusing on community level interventions? Are we supposed to actually embark on structural transformation that actually deals with the problem of intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, it's hard because, when you think about scale, sometimes you can only deal with a problem at a particular scale, the scale of the home, the scale of the individual, the scale of the home. But often a lot of these problems are perpetuated at the scale of the nation. Might even be the scale, we say particularly Cape Town, the scale of a city. But at the scale of a nation, it all seems like it's too much, right? We can't really address those problems as effectively. But it is possible. It is probably long term. But I think what I meant by collective resistance is also being able to be brave enough to go back to social organizing in the same way that apartheid was fought, in the same way that colonialism was fought. I mean, if you think about colonialism, all of these things were fought internationally, across borders, at a global scale. The cultural boycott, those things were at a global scale. So, and so dealing with small things at a time also means that be able to address, yes, maybe the pain at the time, but we're not actually addressing what might recur again and again and again and again, generation after generation after generation. And that, again, I'm not sure if I'm answering it in full.
Yes, I think you answered the question. Yeah, the reason why I asked you this question is that, you know, there's a lot of concerted efforts, by NGOs and community-based organizations in trying to help, communities rise above, the challenges of intergenerational trauma. But as long as, we still, trapped in these, structural factors that, drives trauma at a macro level, at a national level, the problems actually remain unaddressed. So this is why I was asking you if, maybe, we actually missing the mark. We should be actually, addressing the social historical and, structural factors that drives, the experience of collective trauma in our communities. So thank you so much. I want to ask Dr. Palmer. You mentioned, in fact, you are involved in a very interesting trend that we see in the healthcare sector, which is, the concept of, decentralizing, healthcare. Can you shed more light on that? Because there's quite a lot of, communities, that are living on the fringes of society, forgotten communities, and they do not have access to healthcare. And these are the very, historically traumatized communities. And maybe, if you could share with us, more detail about how can we go about, decentralizing, mental health care, to reach out to these, communities. Thanks.
Okay, so first and foremost, I think I must say this.
It is very difficult to try and decentralize a problem
That our leaders of our country don't recognize as a problem. And so our discussion itself is very multi-layered. And you made a very interesting, very true comment when you said the awareness.
So most communities are not even aware that they're living trauma on a day-to-day basis. There's actually more. This is life. It's not traumatic, right? And even that is not even suffering. Yeah, it's okay.
This is how I was raised. This is everything that, is a part of my life. And so with Thai, when attempting to decentralize any healthcare service, it does take a collaborative effort. And what I've come to find is people love to slap their own name on a initiative. And I've gotten to the point where I'm like, slapping name on it, okay.
That's my approach. But it's going to take collective effort in order for us to collaborate,
share resources, and start with one thing every time.
try to approach, so like I say, in general, healthcare would be very difficult to do. So, for example, one of the practices is out in Beechwood, and there's a Danone is very close to us, actually right opposite it. And so, what we plan on doing is having something simple, because remember, we also deal with cultural differences. And so, where our culture says we as men don't talk, or within our culture, we don't talk about this, everything stays at home. We don't have the skill set to communicate this. So, what we're doing is let's introduce that to mental health care services first. First, at introduction, this introduced into a different way of thinking or accessing healthcare. And so, something very simple is having our psychologists start a stress management class on a Saturday for free for our matriculates. It's leading up to exam time for them. They don't know how to manage this. But this is an important way to get that community to come say, like, they say, well, you're the officer. So again, I think for us we always think about what a initiative would look like at the big picture. We never take it all the way back down to the sort of raw bones of it and the scaffolding, and start there first, and then as we go, build it up to what it should be. Because schools are available, libraries are available. There's no one in the library. The library is there, but no one is in the library. But it's there. The lights are on. The sit's playing foot. No one's in. So I will not go in there and say, I would like to do this. Can you guys make it available for? I'm not charging for it, but I have a passion for community and I might do that. And sometimes it takes very ordinary people to do extraordinary things, but it's that we're looking at a grand scale of things. We're looking at impacting the whole of Cape Town. Start in your house, start with yourself, start with the people within your community. Because that's where, again, communities become the sticks become solids. So
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. I also was just wondering because the transmission of trauma from one generation to another, is a three-pronged kind of process. I know you mentioned that there's a biological explanation to the phenomenon, but there's also a behavioral, explanation, as well as a systemic, explanation. As in, we're still dealing with the, socioeconomic inequalities, and they actually, help to sort of, perpetuate the challenge. Are there any other ways in which, the problem of, intergenerational trauma at a collective level is transmitted from one generation to another, apart from the behavioral and the, the behavioral as well as the systemic approach, and as well as the epidemics, approach to understanding, to understanding the collectivization of trauma. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, like I said, it's very it's multi-layered, because you could literally go down to implantation of a seed, and then go down to genetics, and then go down to experiential that first 1,000 days being conditioned internally at home, and then looking at what the community's influence is on what that individual deems to be a norm, and then they grow up, and then you're trying to take that exact story of Serafina and what she looked at and perceived the world to be, and now she goes into a whole different world, and they don't know how to regulate their traumatic experience in that space. And so it's, I think everything, and it truly is all about perception and how we experience things. But again, how we experience those things are based on conditions in our house, and how we were raised, and what's true within our families. Because when I look at my own family, the conversations are going to be very difficult. Like experiencing certain things where apartheid, for example, is seen as ja, ek was stuffed, or ja, nee, ja, was, nee, was. That is it. But not also have the skill set to say, I was oppressed, I experienced so much shame, I didn't like the color of my skin, I hated myself, but I had to do what I needed to do in order to survive, just to try and potentially get my family. And so we try to face that. It's also the inability of, like, I'm going to be very intrigued, and I almost stopped to keep my grandfather being a bit out at something. But I don't think that he has the ability to adequately verbalize what he felt and experienced during that poetry time. It's very different for me. I love poetry, and so therefore I love expressing exactly how I feel. And so it becomes a very difficult conversation, and becomes extremely multi-layered. And so there's never one individual approach. And I do believe that it starts with us as an individual. Is the bike stops with us at some point in time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palmer, for a very interesting response. I want to ask Dr. Hussein about government policy. I know within the social work, fraternity, you work closely with the Department of Social Development, and you also engage, in policy matters, at national level. I wanted to know what the government policy as far as dealing with the problem of collective trauma is, and to what extent the policy is effective to actually dealing with the challenges we're facing in South Africa.
Okay, so with the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation, the Act, we actually did provide compensation for people who victims of human rights abuses. The problem with that is that it hasn't been paid out. So so it goes, yeah. So that's the thing, and a lot of, if you
if you're aware of it, across the past couple of years, there's always an occasional discussion about it, and then it goes quiet again. And I think Dr. Makubu mentioned about the crisis we have in leadership. The other policy, there was discussion about addressing trauma, and the idea with the TRC was that there would be a follow up in dealing with national trauma, and that only took place in certain provinces, and it was really limited. So I know, for example, that members who experienced severe trauma, particularly in Konto Sizwe, they got some trauma, but even I've spoken to some of the members and they said it was 3 sessions. And how do you kind of address torture in that way? And we did have they do have the trauma center, which was initially meant for that purpose. So there have been initiatives that they've lasted for short periods of time. The Western Cape government has started to do intergenerational dialogues in communities, where they've gone into several communities and they're intending on keeping it and continuing with it, where social workers will come in. And I've been part of some of that, where they've had like 60 families come in and they do, and national government is also involved. It's part of the national development plan. So there are some initiatives that they've rolled that out through, they're trying to roll it out to all the provinces, and has actually taken place last year. So there's some movement, but unfortunately not every community is part of that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your response. I want to come back to you, Dr. Makubu, with regard to the role of art and performance, as well as storytelling in healing. Maybe you could share with us some of the best practices or other examples of how art, performance, and storytelling has actually led to healing in any context in your artistry career. So.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think I must admit, because I mean, obviously, when a question like this is posed, is that we want to glorify art and amplify what it can or can't do. But I think we also have to admit that much of the art that's produced is also just serves commercial purposes, right? So, a lot of it is really it's the wealthy, it's the it's petrol companies, it's oil companies, it's banks that buy art. That so there's that dark reality of it. There's a lot that's really important that's happening in that's initiated by artist collectives and community arts projects here in Cape Town. We used to have the community arts project, which I think was really important in getting people to visualize. I mean, if I think about one of the artists who was part of CAP, Sophie Peters, who for a long time nobody was inviting her to come and tell her story, and just listening to her talk about things that she witnessed and how she was then able to represent that through painting is incredible, right? And how that allowed her to reflect, but to make sense of the world and things that were happening around her. So there is that other side of it. And then, of course, there's the interventionist type of works, which I think are quite important. And then they go back to this point that I'm making about perceptibility. And an example of that is, of course, what Jay Pather's work on infecting the city. And one of the examples that comes to my mind was a work by an artist called Intutuzeli Zeba. Because we often, because this spatial segregation means that we can talk about shacks and for people who don't live in townships, it's something that's distant. Yes, it's a problem, but because you don't see it every day, it's a problem you never really have to address. And so what Intutuzeli does is that his artwork was he built a shack, put it on wheels, and he would drag the whole shack from the townships into the city. So, of course, this particular performance he did from the Company Gardens, and took it to campus. But to have this presence already unsettles the way that society is organized, which I think makes it perceptible. It brings it into close proximity, right? And it makes us, you know, it's not just a problem that's so far too big, too abstract to deal with. It's right there. And then you're reminded that it's the students who are here, it's the keeners who are here that are actually sustaining the city. It's the people who live in the township whose bodies, whose labor is poured into sustaining this thing, right? That seem to be progress. So I think in that sense, you know, it's distinguishing the types of arts that are people-centered, but the ones that actually enable us to see things a different way, that are important to me. And of course, there's art therapy, which I think is also fantastic. I mean, I've seen how amazing it has been for children, because children can always make sense of the world in the way we, you know, adults make sense of the world, but they're smart, right? Sometimes they might not have a vocabulary for particular things, but they will certainly have a visualization or some other way of performing something out. So they're differentiated projects that I think speak to this question of collective trauma, which I think are quite different from, you know, sort of glitzy, elite art gallery type of work.
Thank you so much, Ta. It's a very elaborate response. But we'll come back to the, you know, person of interventions. I think at this juncture, we can maybe open, you know, for any questions. If you have questions for our manualists, this is the time for you to ask questions. Yes.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. So I wanted to ask Dr. Mako. I think she mentioned something about collective trauma being in the past, like the definition assumes that trauma happened in the past. So, but we know that is not true. There are people still living with trauma, especially in Black Township with the ongoing gang violence or something like that. So I wanted to ask, how can like we include like the continuous trauma term into our diagnostic manuals such as DSM-5, because it's not included there. Like the DSM-5, it assumes that trauma happened in the past, like PTSD, but like it doesn't include like the ongoing trauma that is happening, especially in Black Township, because trauma is happening every day. So there's no like definition for the ongoing trauma. So how can we include that? That was my question.
Okay, thank you for the question. So maybe just to clarify at the beginning, I was saying that a number of people who define collective trauma talk about it as a response to an event, a traumatic event. So I was saying that the things that are causing trauma are not events. You know, the continuation of colonialism and it's not an event. It's still present. But I was trying to, I didn't catch the word. Is it how can we include it in as that? Oh, maybe I might go to the dot.
So I will say this: you must again, every community and every country has their own trauma and what is deemed to be trauma. The unfortunate reality is here in South Africa. So let's say Africa at large. If you look at all of our medical training or healthcare training, mental health training, where are all of our where's our literature coming from? It's the US. We apply it here. But the unfortunate reality is that we're becoming better at it, but we are a data poor country when it comes to these kind of things. And so therefore, I'm pretty sure that your psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers will probably write to the American Association
till they're blue in the face and there's no ink on the planet, and it'll probably be disregarded. But what I think is that with you potentially stepping into that space, it shows that you have a keen sense of awareness. And so I want to say this, even for me in healthcare, you are trained, right, with a base set of knowledge. I think the importance is how, again, you perceive it for your community, right? And then how it is applied becomes important. Because you have that key sense of, and I believe that's something that makes me a very different type of doctor, because I've traveled around the country and worked in different communities where I learned a lot about the people. And so this is where my love for decentralization of healthcare was, because I lived in the Northwest for a year, where it is actually a representation probably about 70% of what 70% of our people in South Africa actually do on a day-to-day basis, where you see that it justs, right? And so it defined me in terms of how I deliver healthcare. And I think that's the important part. So while you are aware of it, remember, it doesn't have to be in a DSM-5 in order for you to acknowledge that this is an ongoing problem within our country. And so I will become someone who establishes a protocol. Today's day and age, there's no boundaries anymore. There's nothing. There's a book that I started reading. The mountain is you. You are the only thing that stops you from making this a form of practice within your own practice and within your community. Eventually, people are going to latch onto what you're doing and say, tell us more about this. And love to see how we can come alongside you. Teach us. Right? So I don't think it will ever be included in the DSL. We may not say ever. Nothing is ever linear. But I think it will be very difficult until such time that we as South African healthcare workers will actually start investing in developing our own literature and diagnostic tool sets. Only then will these things become applicable within our country.
Can I quickly respond to that? And community psychologists and our psychologists, not all of them, but those who are aware do understand that how, and will not necessarily use the DSM-5 to work with the communities and the people that they serve. And there are alternative tools that Global South people have developed. So we have chosen to not use the DSM-5 to understand trauma.
Oh. Yeah, maybe to respond to that, the DSM-5 and the ICD-9 include elements of complexity in post-traumatic stress disorder. That's why a lot of people diagnose it as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I like the presentation. There's a lot of predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuators, but I didn't hear a lot about the protective elements of I don't know how to use it, because there's three terminologies that we use. It's either intergenerational, which you're not doing too, multi-generations over a lot, and transgenerational from one generation to another. So the question that I'm sitting with is, how much of truth becomes a traumatic burden? I think the gentleman said the truth will set you free. But we also talk about Dr. Death. He's a very intelligent man, highly intelligent. Although we don't like him, I like his intelligence. He's a cardiologist. The question is, how much of truth do we tell our children with a particular spin that becomes abductive reasoning rather than deductive or inductive reasoning? It creates an emotional, unseated sort of trauma. And I think maybe we need to look at that, because we look at a lot of stories about the past, and we're talking about echoes of the past.
are we passing on those echoes, not deliberately, by putting a particular spin on our own trauma or the historical trauma?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mervyn Kutsia. I'm from the United States of Pontebbo. I don't know why you're laughing. Both is true. I was born and raised in number 11 Mulberry Street. You know, Bondewell itself was also stratified. You had Upper Bondewell, Central Bondewell, and Netrecht, where I lived. I also did live in the United States for 20 years. The reason why I mentioned that is that over the years I brought friends and colleagues to my home country and took them into the houses where I lived. And within 2 days, we would have a debrief and they would say, Merle, how are you even sane? Because they see the divide, the leafy suburbs of Durbanville and the Table Mountain and those places. And then you can look down from UCT's Jammy Steps and see the township. They couldn't compute. And I mean, I'm just talking superficially. There were many times I used to run a camping ministry for children, you know, from Swartfield at Smartin Town in Wellington with these group of South Africans and Americans. And I took them right into the townships of Kosso, Wudetu, Bontebbo, Manipur, and as I said, Smarty Town and places in Pa. And in fact, they were traumatized by just what they saw and experienced. Just a quick little glimpse into my family life. We lost our dad when I was 8 years old, so my mom had to raise the 6 of us by herself in Bontebbo. And the irony of the story is, we live right next door to the gangsters, the Young Red Killers, the Cape Town Scorpion. But none of us drink or smoke. And I don't know how to explain that. I've never smoked a cigarette in my entire life. And, you know, the people ask me, but what happened? I honestly don't have an answer to that. My older brother was shot in 1976. He survived, Benito. He just flew back to Scotland, where he's now living for about 18 years. Last year, I took him back to the street next to Arcadia High School. And he got out for the first time in 49 years. It'll be 50 years this year. And he said, die is wat hulle my geskiet het, dat ek val. Some of you might remember Christopher Truton was shot with him, and Christopher passed on a few days later. My question is this, I'm going to try to simplify it for the sake of time and brevity, is how do we even begin to address the complexity? I mean, it is so complex, the trauma. There's so many layers and levels, as our panelists have articulated. My question to you is like, if we were to come up with the top 5 approaches to addressing, you know, the various traumas, what would that look like? I see in my mind's eye that conversation like these need to be ubiquitous. It need to be all over the social media, on TV and stuff, if we are going to educate our children, the generations that this is what our parents and our grandparents and some of us have endured. So my question is, how would you sum up the top 5 approaches to the addressing the issues of trauma? Thank you.
Like, do we want to answer those 2 questions first? Okay, so
I'm going to forget.
So maybe let me respond to the question about the burden of the truth. And I think part of the question you asked earlier, Leo, included storytelling, which I realize now that I didn't address in my response. And maybe one way to respond to that is that is through an example of work that I did in a place called Everton. And when we were there, we met. Everton is a place where that used to be a freehold area. You had Black people who bought pieces of land from 1905 onwards, which was way before the 1913 Land Act. And then, of course, during apartheid, that land was expropriated. And so today, when you go there, the poverty, the neglect, right? And then, but when you talk to young people in Everton, it's just a horrible place that nobody wants to live in. The young kids, everybody just wants to leave, you know, and they have no idea. We go to the older people, they're sitting with photographs and albums of amazing institutions like the Wilberforce Institute, where you had, you know, sort of American scholars, African Americans who started that institute, or people who were educated there who have now went up, you know, political figures. And that's a story about that safe place that they actually did not know. You know, it was assumption is that Everton was actually created under apartheid. It was one of those, you know, townships, etc. But it has a much longer history. But if those stories are not told, I think that there's the risk, right? So it's balancing the burden of the truth with knowing the truth in order to navigate your present. Because otherwise you don't know what you're sitting on. You have no idea what you're looking at. It's hard to make sense of that world, you know, because you just want to leave it rather than actually understanding what you can do with that truth. But yeah, I mean, it's again, it's not to say the one is less important than the other, but I think there's an important balance to be kept there. And I think, you know, if you think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in terms of narrativizing those stories, which I mean, I think part of the most crude aspect of it was also spectacularizing the pain of Black families on television. But some of those stories needed to be heard and to be aired because people were sitting with a question mark. What happened to my family member? I have a brother who disappeared. I have a cousin who disappeared, or, you know, that to not have that in and of itself, sitting and living with that silence and unknowing, that in itself is a burden. Yeah, but that's just to respond to that. I'm still thinking about the approaches, the 5 approaches.
I can respond to the burden of truth maybe on a practical basis, because I work with children and young people and families. You share the truth with children in an age appropriate way, depending on their developmental age. I've seen storybooks about apartheid for 11-year-olds, like 10-year-olds, and 5-year-olds, different age groups at some of the bookshops. And that is how they chose to share it. So there are ways in which we can share it. Also, sometimes we assume children don't know. And the not knowing is worse for children, because children and young people who make up their own mind about what happened. And we would rather want to then give them the tools of what actually happened than allow them to come up with their own stories, because depending on their developmental age, some children may think that, you know, dad is going to die if they just hear dad being sick. So it is better and to think about sharing it with children, traumatic stories in an age appropriate way. And there are resources in our communities that have that. The top 5 approaches, there aren't really 5. What academics and researchers around the world say, and I've experienced some of that, is social support. We don't need a psychiatrist or a necessary a psychologist. Those are the extreme cases. But social support, the space where you feel safe to share what has happened to you, the people that you can trust, and the untold stories. And some of this is about creating these spaces that you share with, whether it's your community of faith, whether that's in your own community at an NGO. They are community centers or community organizations that allow for these spaces. I just am aware also that the research that Professor Swartz did. She is fully at the Human Sciences Research Council now. She was at UCT. Actually said that 60 to 75% of our population actually don't want to talk about the past. So we need to deal with that some people actually would prefer, and it's also okay if people are unable to articulate. Sometimes we can deal with our trauma in non-verbal ways, and that's also okay. But definitely the top one is social support. Another one would be dialogues, community dialogues, intergenerational dialogues, sharing the untold story. Yeah, thanks.
Solidarity.
I'll be taking more questions. Just two more questions. And we revert back to the question of interventions because I see in the audience is much interest in what we can do to actually break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. Thanks.
Thank you for the timely discussion because I think the violence in our communities are not just historical. It's very much economically assigned as well, and we don't address it. But I think and I'm glad you spoke about people outside of the profession of a psychologist and a psychiatrist. I've put on my status today, bullying starts at home. The first bully is your unhealed parent. And so there's a perpetual thing of what happens. And, what is so sad is I've submitted a proposal to do trauma-related experiences post-COVID. It was not accepted in this country. It was accepted outside the borders of this country. So I need to do it here, just for the permission from the university, but I cannot do it in a hospital setting. Yet when I engaged the post-trauma of COVID, it was horrific because people have not dealt with that trauma. And so the intergenerational trauma, the current trauma, because even in the hospital corridors, you're not safe. And so when do we really start the collective approach to address the current and move communities from accepting violence to actually saying a no is a no?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. Grateful to be here. And I think this meeting tonight maybe is one of the steps to ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I think it's this Dr. Palmer who mentioned something to the effect like even at conception, I'm not sure if I can say the quality of the sperm actually can be something that is a trauma that is passed up intergenerationally. That was striking for me, and I think I'm not sure if this is a live forum to ask that. I want to know when can HBC life begins, because then it means I think you also said that our kids are a reflection of ourselves, even though we can hate it or dislike looking at ourselves in that mirror. So my question is when does life actually start? Thank you.
Right. So I think I'll address the when do we start with our changes and addressing these issues. We should have started decades ago, as the best honest. The difficulty in this lies that it's a willingness of both parties. We also live in a country where communication is a massively, you've got what 12 official languages. Why word changes across cultural groups and across different languages. And so communication becomes difficult. And we haven't understood yet that communication is twofold. One, it's speaking, and two is to listen with understand. We are geared towards listening with a reaction or a response. And so a conversation or a dialogue often becomes it's one way. I tell you about my experience, but not also completely. And this is that topic again, or that point of honesty versus transparency. And I think when we have it's almost got to be so what are you here for? Shoot, lost my train of thought. To what degree do we give information to our kids? And we have to have that dialogue with ourselves first. And probably the best way to do it is to write it down and then refine it several times, because you also know what your kids can and can't handle to a degree. Some of you get, like my father wrote an article about me when I was 13 years old. I had gone over to Iceland for soccer, and my father had written that I deal with disappointment well. And I read that, I was like, no, you're wrong. But I'm glad that he used that, but it made me think about it at that point in time. But it was really anti at the point in time. So it is about having better discernment about your kids. What can you do? But it's also defining it for yourself and using the right terminology and being able to say, this is what happened to me. And I want you to understand. So, for example, with me, I am going to tell my kids one day, this is boundaries that never get crossed. Someone says something, looks at you a certain way, touches you a certain way. So that was experiential. So I will educate you on that. And we don't negotiate. I don't care who it is, we don't negotiate. The second part is this is what has happened, and this is how it has affected me up until the age of 34, where I'm still experiencing different layers of that traumatic experience. Where it redefined what sex looks like to me. It redefined how much respect and honor I give my body. And that with what I thought this was just a frivolous act was actually the greatest form of disrespect that I had for myself and the lack of love that I showed towards myself. And so I needed to understand all of those things need to be discussed, because I become a reflection of it is possible to heal if I'm willing to address. And so those are the discussions we have, and that's how we've got to structure those conversations. And so to consider the fact that when does life begin? I don't know, you better ask God that one. Because there's different theories, right? In certain countries, they'll say from the time of conception, if there's a positive pregnancy test, that's a lifetime. Other countries will say until there's a heartbeat, which our technology can only detect between 10 and 12 weeks. Okay. And this is why with the termination of pregnancy is usually at your own choice up to 12 weeks. Often thereafter, you need court orders and a whole bunch of stuff. But yeah, so it's not necessarily quality of semen. It was just a study being done that looked at the fathers of these kids and did an assessment and said, look back at those ones. What were you experiencing at that point in time? And what is it plausible that this was also downloaded into all of that entire experience? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the questions. I think for the sake of time, we cannot take any more questions. But this is a dialogue that we can always, have on a different time in future. And I want us to maybe, I know in the course of this discussion, we have touched on the question of interventions. But I wanted to maybe drive this conversation in a different direction. I know, Dr. Lakubu, you're an academic, you're well versed with the concept of decolonization. And also, Dr. Shanaz, you're also an academic, you also, well versed with the concept of, African, centered, interventions. There was a question about, using a US, made kind of, system for assessments, right? So right now in the medical field and many other, sectors, we have a problem where we take all these modules from, Western countries and try to replicate them in South Africa. So at this point, there's a question about how do we go about decolonizing, academia? How do we go about decolonizing
ourselves as people. So is there any possibility for an African-centered, or rather a South African, an intervention strategy that actually speaks to the South African context in the spirit of decolonization? I'll start with you, Dr. Makuba. I know you are in a rush. Maybe you can, start, answering that question before you leave. Thanks.
Thank you. I did not expect that question. But I have to head back to my daughter. So after responding, I'll maybe leave, and apologies for that. But, I think in the discussion in academia, of course, there's been the distinction between decolonization, which is the formal process of decolonizing, but there's decoloniality, which addresses the complex systems of coloniality that we are living in. But I think that what has been particularly important about this resurgence of decoloniality, decolonization discourse is the importance of epistemic justice. And I think that the word that hasn't been coming up enough this evening is the question of justice. That people feel that there's a just response to the injustices that they are going through, right? So see, and then that's the thing that exhausts you. So there's being given all the tools of being human in the world, and that has to happen through when we start to believe that the whole, the system is geared towards actually creating just worlds. And at the moment, it feels like that's not the case. It's the CRC, but you're saying the perpetrators are freed, so there's no sense of justice to begin with. The nation itself is born and rooted in a sense of injustice. So and I think that's for me that tips the scales. And even when we talk about decolonization or decoloniality, and maybe a whole lot of other things, I think what makes it distinct in South Africa is that because it happened in universities, it's also recognizing that because there's no access to quality education, because there's no access to healthcare, quality healthcare. Don't want to say things that obviously you would know better, but that sense that there's the government isn't providing children the tools to be able to make that life livable. I mean, if you look at the schools, I was actually saying I have to ask. Like I said to my husband the other day, and I said, I feel as though it's not recognized that the fact that we have a very weak basic education system is in and of itself a violence. It's a doing too, because you're not providing children the tools to actually be able to articulate, to participate in the public sphere, to make sense of everything, and then you become an adult, and then it's harder to actually, that is an injustice, right? And this is why the question of knowledge and access to higher education was central to that discussion. And of course, the other part of it was class and recognizing the significance of working against class, which is thinking about justice in relation to the sort of structure of class and how it works. But yeah, my apologies. I'm going to have to leave. My poor daughter is probably waiting for me. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for this platform.
Can I just add to what you said? So there's a book by Professor Jake and Gatsa. Cool. No, we need to act. And it was written while he was at UFS, and it was a whole bunch of letters over his tenure there from students and discussions that he had with students. And in that book, it is very interesting that he actually predicted that what the Department of Education was going to do was drop the pass mark. And this was well before it actually happened. And he mentions in there that this is a form of oppression. 100% is. Alright? But here's the truth of it. We as the community members didn't stand up. We are to play. We didn't go to that Bulls conversations. When they put it out there, you didn't fight hard enough. Even with mass literacy, kids are taking it as a way out instead of teachers investing more time.
Yeah.
So we need to, and I always say, even with my patients when it comes to healthcare stuff, right? We have to look at ourselves first, be responsible for ourselves first, and then for our neighbor. That is the reality. Our communities are the way they are is also because nowadays you can't to tell hiding even. That's crazy because when I remember growing up, if my uncle smoked a cigarette and I was standing with him, we both got ID. I never smoked, but we both got ID. And we got ID from a neighbor first, then my grandparents, and then when my father came to fetch me, I got the third one. Not like I was just a bystander. But we are not allowed to take care of our communities when we were told and raised that, you know, in a sense that it takes a community to raise a kid, and it truly does. And the communities are, we've let go of our communities. But one of the things to answer the question also is that WITS, they've got in Swallow, they've got a medical center there where they actually took the traditional healers and then westernized medicine, the traditional doctors, and put it together to try and improve the healthcare of the community because the traditional leaders had more of a pull in terms of how patients or people were treated. So there was this discussion about dry TB and wet TB. And the wet or the dry TB was in fact what they thought was the ancestors calling them to be traditional healers, and the people actually had TB and were happy. So just because they didn't present with the common symptoms. Right? So what they did was they built a facility to bridge that gap. And they start having those discussions and start educating them. So the doctors had to sit and say, tell us about the community. We want to know about you as the people so we can assist. And so now there's actually been a massive uptake in terms of TB and HIV treatment with the hair community. And they're doing exceptionally well, you know. So that's, again, just, I think, a testament to collaborative effort. And instead of forcing things on, let's go in for it, understand you first. It's like, say, you are thirsty and then I give you bread. Doesn't make sense.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Palmer.
Yeah, so just briefly, to say that, yeah, I think that I slightly differ that sometimes people are in survival mode and it's very difficult to see beyond meeting their immediate needs. I also think that we received our rights in 1994. That's not very long ago. So we have generations who do not understand what it means to be a citizen. And you are lots younger than me, so I completely understand you all in a different generation. But I kind of grew up in my parents where we didn't know what it means for us to be a citizen. I mean, I also think that people in the States sometimes don't know what citizenship means. And so often when I tell my students, one of the key things you're going to have to do in your community is tell them what it means to become a citizen and how you hold politicians accountable, because our communities don't know how. So that's maybe on that's our responsibility. In terms of decolonial or decoloniality, decolonization for the non-academics, think of it as I saw last week that the education department has only now decided that they are going to change the history and will not focus on Jan van Riebeeck. I mean, that should have happened decades ago. So that's how slowly decolonization happens. So what it basically is are we still living as if we are colonized and subjects to the colonizers? How do we replicate those relationships? So if you are still nie-basing and ja-basing, then you have not been decolonized. It's about becoming aware of the ways. It's a process, it's an ongoing process of awareness that you will not continue to replicate those relationships. So another thing is gendered relationships. Sarah Bartman was held naked and sold to the Piccadilly Circus in London. Her body displayed there because of the way she looked. Today, there's femicide where women's bodies have been destroyed and have been used in the same way, subjected to immense violence and killed. That is the same thing. So, in other words, if we are living according to the past and the values and the race and the gendered divisions, then we are not colonized, we are not decolonized, and we need to disrupt that. So, in other words, I choose to behave in a specific way. I choose to confront the education system. I choose to behave differently to my partner, to men, to women, etc. And that's when we become decolonized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osei. I'll get over my colleague Tulani to do the closing remarks. Thanks.
Thanks, Baron. Thanks, INS colleagues. I think my task was really to sum things up. What do we call it? Closing, and I feel like it's a very.
I'm so sorry to hijack your moment. I'll try not to be long, I promise. The answer to prayer, and I'm an ethical leadership practitioner, a keynote speaker. But what you said, Dr. Shanaz, is so accurate, and it really resonated with me. And I'll share a little bit of my background, but just in terms of what you see, and I think what we are witnessing here is that when we got our democratic freedom in 1994, we lost that drive and that activism. It was so prevalent across our communities. We became passive. We became compliant. And, I see this, and so a lot of my work that I do is, like I said, ethical leadership. And it's based on a lived experience where when I was 16 years old, living on the Cake Flats in Heidelberg, I began writing letters to political prisoners on Robben Island. And this carried on for a few years. 3 decades later, one of the prisoners found me on social media and we reconnected, and he actually returned all those letters to me. And so I work with institutions to help him understand, how leadership is formed, because I believe leadership isn't formed. Leadership doesn't begin when you are given power or you are given a position or you are given a title. Leadership begins in that courage that no one sees. It's that shaking voice when you decide you're going to speak up in a meeting, or you see something that's happening that is, that in your heart, I must speak up against it. This is not right. This is not just. And so as a 16-year-old, I was visiting political prisoners under surveillance, under police surveillance, and obviously the letters that I was writing was opening and read by the prison censor office. So I have a firm belief that we all have that leadership qualities within us. And it's not, like I said, it's not based on when you're given power or title or position. So young people of today may not be activists for democracy, but there's certainly social challenges, economic challenges that the youth in South Africa today can stand up and take on that fight and speak up and take responsibility. Like you said, Being a citizen means you can't just sit back and see things happening. You've also got to know that you have that responsibility to speak up and act. So that was just my brother to talk. Hey.
I'm normally a stickler for time. I had no idea why I did that. But I think what I was going to say is it's very difficult to close such a topic because it's so broad and it really can't be closed. And I think one of the things that caught me was the issue of how I think it was Dr. Hussein who said we cannot heal from what we have not acknowledged. And that hit me real hard because I feel as a country, we are not acknowledging a lot of things. And what was running through my head at among many things, many voices, and what was really running through my head was the issue of, as a nation, it's systemic. We are being forced to forget our trauma. Uh, Take for instance March 21, June 60, Human Rights Day, Youth Day. The youth today do not know that that's Sharpeville massacre, and that is when the Soweto uprising occurred. I know that because I once asked my students that about 4 years ago. They do not know that. So it's a very that's why I say it's very hard to close. So I hope Leo, it says there are pathways to healing to that. I did talk to Leo after that, talk to Dr. Wade after that, talk to Dr. Hussein. I know nothing. Yeah, I'm not going now. Um, but with that, I'll also just want to thank uh, thank you guys mostly for being here, for taking time to participate in the Cornerstone Critical Dialogues. I want to thank the Critical Dialogue Committee that sets this up, chaired by Leo Bapira. I'd like to thank the marketing team for taking our abuse. Most importantly, I would like to thank the panelists for being here. I'm still trying to figure out where we met. I think I've got it. I've got it. And thank you. Who have I missed? I thank the committee. That's most important. So I'm good with Leo. Life's good for me. So I think let's take the time to, as there are treats outside, just outside, and mingle, network, get to connect. And I think one of the things we try to do as Cornerstone is to create a community, so that we don't drift. So do network, do get to know someone. Thank you.